Welcome to Beer and Politics. We are your intractable hosts, Ryan and Ryan. That's right, we cannot be tracked. Today we start part 2 in our series on white privilege, poverty in the black community, and personal responsibility. But of course, before we do, Madam Brewmaster, what do we have on tap today?
Today we have Anchor Porter by Anchor Brewing Company.
Anchor Porter. This is a porter beer from Anchor Brewing in San Francisco, California. Porter, not going to be quite as dark as a stout. It's going to be, I'll say lighter, relatively speaking. As you can see, it's a beautiful dark color. It's going to have a nice thick head. It should be really malty, really roasty, low on the hops too. Yeah. What do you think?
I'll start off with the color. I think it looks great. I do like the head on it. So visually, this is a great looking porter to me.
Yeah.
Taste-wise, what I find is I feel like it's probably a little bit too light in body for me. And I feel like, I don't know if it's hoppy, but there's something that is not as malty and rich as I would have liked.
Yeah, this does seem a little light on the body. I think you hit that one square on the head. I don't think it may be the hops, because I think Anchor tends to hop their beers on the heavy side for any sort of style. But this could even be the malts were roasted too long.
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe, because there is a little bit of a bitterness, but it's not.
Sure.
It doesn't taste hoppy.
Yeah.
But it's a reasonable beer.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah,
I like the carbonation too. I think carbonation is a good level for me.
I agree. I think it's great. It helps with that beautiful thick head.
Yep.
Anyway, I'd give this 3 1/4 worst people in the planets.
Okay, I only give it maybe 2 3/4 drunken sailors.
All right.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you to Anchor Brewing for your reasonable porter.
Yeah, it's reasonable.
They clearly don't sponsor us.
They do not. But we'll try other beers, don't worry.
Yeah.
So before we get into part 2 of our discussion today, we want to recap a few things in part 1, which is where we focused on personal responsibility. Specifically, we focused on the assertion that Ben Shapiro believes that there are 3 behaviors that he labels personally responsible behaviors that are the primary drivers of financial success. Those behaviors are graduating from high school, having a full-time job, and not having children out of wedlock before the age of 21.
Okay.
So there are a few things we want to kind of wrap up in a bow for you that we didn't get to talk about, and I think you lead off with the thoughts on that.
Yeah, so largely we're asking children to do this, because who's graduating from high school? Kids.
Yeah. People under 18 typically.
Yeah. Who are we asking not to have children out of wedlock before the age of 21?
People under the age of 21.
Right. And I know
kids.
Yeah, technically they're adults. No, they're kids.
They're kids.
Because people who are young are stupid.
Yep.
They make horrible decisions
all the time.
Which is why we don't trust them to do things that are important.
And they have parents.
Right. So there's that.
Yeah.
Also, I want to point out that Ben Shapiro uses specifically the term full-time job. And that makes us wonder, he uses the term full-time job, not 40 hours a week, not 2 part-time jobs. And why do you think that might be?
I have no idea.
I would think because a full-time job has different legal requirements. Benefits of some sort are required with full-time jobs. And when you think about a full-time job, when you think about someone in the middle class working, you think about them working a full-time job, perhaps a salaried position. You think of the middle class, you don't think of someone working 2 part-time jobs.
That's true.
Even though you might be working 50 or 60 hours a week.
Sure.
So what is he saying? That if you have a good job, you'll end up in the middle class? Yeah, no shit, Ben.
So we looked at all those statistics. We looked at income levels. We looked at those 3 behaviors. And we looked at the trends because we're talking about how behaviors have changed. And what we found is the trend across all of that between the white and black community is the trends are the same. All right? And in fact, in the black community, they're closing the gap in 2 out of 3 of those behaviors on the white community. And if the behaviors are the same and the trends are the same, then why do we still have this gigantic income gap between the two races? And while it's true, possibly, that your behavior will drive your financial success, as the Brookings Institute study shows us, we find that environment is at least as important, if not more so, because it shapes your behavior.
Shapes who you are.
That's right. The things that have shaped who you are, those are your parents, your friends, your family, their quality of education, the availability of jobs where you live, the availability of goods and services where you live, the safety that surrounds you based on where your parents decided to build a house or buy a house in which you grew up. Your environment mattered.
The average income.
Your average income clearly matters. And what we find is wealth begets wealth and poverty begets poverty. So the question we're answering today is, if all the trends are the same, why is the black community largely the only one in poverty?
So what we're going to do here is take a look at the history of the environment of the black community throughout the history of the United States. And who better to take you on a journey through the black experience than a white guy in his 30s?
That's him.
That's me. So with that said, we are going to go back to the year 1619, when the first black slaves arrived on the shores of the United States. Now, slavery wasn't huge then. It wasn't until around 1670, when most scholars agree, that slavery became an institution in the United States, and that was with the creation of the city of Charleston in the province of Carolina.
Okay.
Now, I think we can all agree, I think we'll all be on the same page, even the skeptics out there, that slavery as an institution was disadvantageous for black people, that it advantaged white people, and it was not a great way for black people to better themselves or accrue any sort of wealth. So I think we can just basically skip over that.
I hope so.
Yeah, so we're going to jump ahead quite a long ways until 1865.
What happened then?
1865, that was the passage of the 13th Amendment,
Okay.
which ended slavery in the United States. Legal slavery, for those of you who may want to pick bones.
Okay.
Now, this is 246 years after slaves were first brought to the coast of the United States. That is nearly 10 generations.
Okay.
And a fun fact for you is that as a country, we practiced slavery on these shores longer than the United States has been a country. So that's a great little piece of perspective there.
So we've had slavery longer than we've been a country.
Yes,
Wow.
to this day. So with slavery ended, black people just go out and get great jobs, right?
That's what I hear.
Yeah, no, of course not. They don't have education. Realistically, they don't have education. So black people get jobs that they had largely been doing, whether it be farm worker or servant. It's basically what you got going for you. So they're not making a lot of money, but they go and they continue to do this work. And what you see in the South, 1865, is the beginning of black codes.
Okay.
Now, black codes were laws that essentially mimicked slavery. For instance, the laborers were required to live on the property of the employer. The employer was legally to be referred to as master. You were not allowed to leave the premises. You were not allowed to have visitors without the permission of the master. If you were under the age of 18, you could be whipped moderately for discipline. If you were over the age of 18, you could still be whipped, although it did require a court order.
That does sound a lot like slavery.
It does. It does. And so this seems like a pretty raw deal. So maybe you wouldn't want to do this. So why wouldn't they just go live off the land?
Sure.
After all, I mean, they can do a lot of farming. They're really good at that.
If you don't like it,
Just go
leave.
somewhere else, right? Well, as it turns out, in the South, part of this was vagrancy laws, meaning they made it illegal to not have a job. So you couldn't just go live off of the land because you didn't have a job. Therefore, you were a criminal. And a wonderful stipulation in the 13th Amendment is you cannot be forced into involuntary servitude unless you've been duly convicted of a crime. So if you're convicted of the crime of not having a job, you can then be put back into forced servitude. So the sheriffs could then lease your labor out to local farmers. So what we find is 2 years later, this didn't last for long. This didn't go on for very long. So 1867, the North said, screw you guys. Slavery is illegal. We literally fought a war only about this.
Boom. Slavery's gone. Good.
So what we see is the beginning of Reconstruction. 1867, the North moves into the South. There is an occupation of the South, where
Wow.
they enforce the laws and they enforce the rights that black people now have as freed men. Now, Reconstruction is a period of relative prosperity for black people.
So we're in Reconstruction now?
We are in Reconstruction.
Okay.
And what they're able to do is vote. They are able to hold public office in some cases. So again, this is a period of relative prosperity. In the year 1868, we see the passage of the 14th Amendment. And that is the amendment saying all citizens get equal protection under the law to ensure that black people get the rights they deserve under the law. In 1870,
Okay.
we see the passage of the 15th Amendment.
Perfect.
Which is, of course, the amendment that says you are not allowed to discriminate against voters based on race, color, or condition of previous servitude.
Perfect.
So remember these three: race, color, or condition of previous servitude.
Okay.
This might come up a little bit later. And we're talking about the South a lot, but we're talking about the South a lot for a reason. At this time, in 1870, over 85% of black people in the United States live in the South.
That makes sense.
So any law, we're talking about any law going into effect in the South regarding black people has a significant effect on the black population as a whole in this country. So, also at this time, around 9% of black people lived in the cities. Around 91% lived out in the country on the farms. And this actually tracks along with white people.
Okay.
So at the same rate, black people and white people are living in the cities and in the country.
Okay.
So we're going to move on a little bit. Now, in this period of Reconstruction, we see the South becoming more upset because they're being occupied.
Right.
We see the formation of the Ku Klux Klan by the unbelievably racist Democrats of the day. Later became to be known as the Dixiecrats. And what they did, they wanted to preserve the Southern way of life.
Sure.
And they lynched black people.
Oh my.
One of the things that actually I believe was more effective for their cause, they began to murder local Republican officials who supported these laws of the North and these equal rights. And what we see is over the next few years, with rising Southern aggression and increasing Northern apathy, the Northern white politicians kind of give up the cause of trying to protect black people, because what they want to do is put this civil war and put all this animosity behind them. They are more concerned with healing the wounds of the nation than protecting a large segment of the nation's population.
Right. They want to move forward without actually moving forward.
Right. Keep in mind, as we've talked about before, it's not like the North wasn't racist. So, 1877, we see the end of Reconstruction. The North leaves the South, and the South is again allowed to practice their states' rights and self-direction.
Good for them.
Good for them. So we see in 1877 the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of the Jim Crow South. Now, the Jim Crow South, for those of you who don't know, Jim Crow was actually a character, and he was created by the performer Thomas Dartmouth Rice in 1828.
Okay.
He was super stereotypical. He's actually one of the first performers to wear blackface, and this kind of became a really popular method and mode of theater.
Oh, so he's a white guy.
Oh, he was a white guy.
I'm a white guy.
He was a
okay.
white guy playing the stereotypical black guy. And we find this became a very, very popular sort of form of entertainment, and it became very popular, and it lasted for a really long time. We'll get into that a little bit later in this series. Originally, Jim Crow was kind of a slur. It washed away, it was diluted, and it became to mean these laws in the South. So the Jim Crow laws were laws that were designed to legally disenfranchise black people and legally establish inequality.
Okay.
The biggest thing with the Jim Crow laws they did was voting rights, because if you keep people from voting, they have no self-determination. So we see things in the South come around like property tests, poll taxes, and literacy tests. Keep in mind, you can't discriminate based on race, color, or condition of previous servitude, but you can discriminate against property. Who has property and who doesn't, okay? We can also say a literacy test. So if you can read or if you can't read, who had education and who didn't. And by the way, literacy tests were administered by a poll worker, and you passed based on their discretion. So it wasn't even a standardized test. One guy could walk up and say, "Can you write an X?" You could write an X. Another guy walks up and says, "Can you read this 7 passages from the Bible without stuttering?"
And I'm sure the poll worker was a black person.
Oh, clearly. They had a lot of rights back then, remember?
Uh-huh.
No. So this was a great way to stop black people from voting without discriminating against black people.
That's right. Illiterate people who didn't have property.
Right. Oh, also the poll taxes. You, in order to register to vote, you had to pay a tax. And the tax was around $1.50 at the time. Some would have administrative fees on top of that, which doesn't sound like a whole lot of money, but when you adjust it for inflation, it's a lot more than you might think. And for people who had literally just come from slavery, this was insurmountable in almost every case. Yeah. And this didn't go far enough for some people, because the downside to all of these is that it also disenfranchised poor or uneducated white people. So certain areas came up with the grandfather clauses, or grandfather laws. And what that did is said, we will look at your ancestry. And if before the era of Reconstruction your ancestors voted, well, by George, you get to vote too. So guess who didn't vote before Reconstruction?
I'm going to go with black people today.
Yeah. So these laws were incredibly effective at stopping black people from voting.
That's really clever from white people. Really clever white people.
So also, again, I need to point out, not voting means you have no ability to self-determine in a political landscape, which is huge, because that's what we're talking about.
Right.
Now, they go beyond this. It's not just disenfranchisement. It is also, on a social level, it is establishing inequality. So segregation, of course, is part of the Jim Crow laws, and everyone's heard of segregation. But things that were segregated: schools, parks, libraries, water fountains, restrooms, buses, trains, and restaurants. But it went further than this. It went into the social aspects of life. For instance, in some areas, black people were not allowed to introduce themselves to white people. If they were introduced to them, they were required by law to call them Mr. or Mrs. last name, whereas the white person would simply call them by their first name.
Perhaps boy, even.
Maybe. I'm sure that would have been fine. It did things like state that black people, under no circumstances, were allowed to take custody of white children. You were not allowed to marry a white person, so can't even marry out of poverty if you really want to.
Right.
White nurses are not allowed to assist black men in hospitals. Even burial grounds were segregated.
Oh, wow.
So they would have a black section and a white section because, God forbid, even in death. And then, even more harshly, black people were not allowed to testify against white people. And just to show you how insidious these laws were, there were right-of-way laws. Right-of-way laws. We all know when you come to a stop sign. Yeah, except it was different. If you were a black person, you always had to wait for the white people to go. It doesn't matter how long you've been there. These are laws that are designed to invade every aspect of your life, and in every possible situation, make sure that the black person knows they are not the same. You are not equal. This is the Jim Crow South.
Right.
Now, that begins, of course, in 1877.
That's 12 years since the end of the Civil War.
Right. Okay. So we're going to jump ahead a little bit to 1890.
Okay.
And, of course, segregation's still going strong with the Separate Car Act in Louisiana. So this is kind of when we see the beginnings of a lot of these laws really coming into fruition.
Okay.
The Separate Car Act in Louisiana established separate rail cars for black people and white people. So if you were a black person, you had to go into the black car, white person, into the white car.
Okay.
A man by the name of Homer Plessy, who was 7/8 white, by the way. 7/8 white, and could pass for a white guy. He bought a ticket on a white car, and he went and he sat in that white car. He was arrested and put in jail. Now, 6 years later, that's why you might remember that name. 6 years later, in 1896, the case made it all the way to the Supreme Court in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, this really tested the 14th Amendment, this idea that you have equal protection under the law.
Okay.
And Plessy argued here that this law is stigmatizing towards black people.
Okay.
Now, Justice Henry Brown of the majority wrote this in response to, well, the case, Plessy's argument. If one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them upon the same plane. He goes on to say, we consider the underlying fallacy of Plessy's argument to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If this be so, it is not by reason of anything found in the act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it. So, no. This separating has nothing to do with you because we think you're lesser. If that's what you got out of this, that's all your fault. That's on you, bro.
You heard what you wanted to hear.
Yeah. Sometimes I think you hear what you want to hear. But now, Justice John Marshall Harlan, for the dissent, the one dissenting vote, he basically said, no, these laws are clearly discriminatory. They're obviously discriminatory. It's obviously for the purpose of separating these people because we don't like them. But interestingly, his objection wasn't legally based on it's discriminatory. It was legally based on, he said the laws infringed on personal freedom because it applied restraints on the individual, on where the individual could go without the due process of law.
I gotcha. Yeah.
And it was a 7-1 decision, of course, ruled in favor of segregation. And with this ruling, segregation got the full support of the Constitution of the United States. So, we're going to jump ahead a little bit to 1910. Now, in 1910, nearly 83% of black people still lived in the South. And also, at this point, around 20% live in the cities. This still tracks with white people. So, you still have about 80% white people and black people living in the country, 20% in the cities. So we're still seeing a real good mix of population, no matter where you are. Okay? So you might ask, well, this is obviously a terrible environment.
Sure.
Why wouldn't you just pick up and leave?
Yeah.
Just go. Why don't you just leave the North? Go to the North.
If you don't like America, get out of it.
Right? And, well, there's a couple reasons. Number one, the North was a vastly different economy at the time. It required skilled labor. It required education.
Sure.
And on top of that, of the black people that lived in the North, the unemployment rate was around 40%. So, yeah, I mean, you've got a job and they treat you like shit and everyone hates you. So why don't you just move to some place where you can't get a job, and even if you could, there's 40% unemployment.
And there's no guarantee that they still don't hate you.
Right. So yes, no, you can't just simply move. It's not reasonable. It's not feasible.
It's pretty cheap.
Sure.
To move.
All that money.
Yeah. All that mass transit they have.
All right. And that brings us a little bit further ahead to the Great Depression of 1929. Now, this is not some kind of law. This isn't something that's designed to hold black people back. The Great Depression was a terrible time. 1929, 1939. Okay? Now, unemployment on average hit up to 25%. Among black people nationwide, it hit 50% unemployment. Now, this is less than 65 years after the end of slavery. Less than 65 years. And so, again, this point isn't to show that it affected people more necessarily, but it's to show how the accumulation of wealth for a population has been exceedingly difficult, if not entirely impossible.
Sure.
So we're going to move forward to 1934. We're going to start with the beginning of the New Deal here. The Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, was created under the New Deal.
Sweet.
This did some really interesting stuff. And this is also important here because we know today one of the greatest ways to build wealth as an American is through home ownership.
Sure.
It's a great thing. You can get a loan for it. You don't have to use your own money. You can use the bank's money.
Right.
It appreciates in value. It's a great way.
You need a home, so you're going to live in the home, so paying for the home is great.
Yeah, you're paying anyway. You might as well pay for your own home, right?
Right.
This is a great way to build wealth. And the feds knew this at the time. Or they wanted it to be. They wanted to see it happen.
Sure.
So this did some interesting stuff. The FHA actually came up with the 20/80 loan that we see and we think of now when we think about getting a bank loan, where the consumer puts down 20% and the bank puts down 80%. Now, the reason that happened is because the Fed said, we will insure these loans. We will insure the American consumer because we know the Americans are hardworking, they'll pay their bills. And so the bank said, yes, this would have been a riskier loan, but since it's insured now by the federal government, let's take these loans. So before this, they had what was a 50-50 loan or even up to a 75-25 loan, meaning you as the consumer would have to put down between 50 and 75% of the value of the home as a down payment.
That's crazy.
So you can see the enormous shift made it much easier to afford a home. Now, in 1934, the average annual income is $1,600 a year.
Wow. Okay.
All right? Now, also, in 1934, the average cost of a new home was $3,500.
Oh.
So put that in perspective. Okay? Now, what that means is if you wanted to buy an average new home, $3,500, with that 20/80 rule, you would have to put down $700.
Okay.
Unless you're black, because keep in mind,
Oh, no.
these rules don't apply to you.
Oh, no.
So you wouldn't get federally insured if you were a black person.
Huh.
Okay, so let's think of this. Let's do this thought experiment.
Okay.
There's a black guy
Yeah.
and there's a white guy. They work exactly the same job. They make exactly the same amount of money.
Sure.
They're both making the average $1,600 a year.
Okay.
Now, when they go to buy a home, they both have $700 to put down.
Right. That makes sense.
The white guy puts down $700, and he's able to get a home with a value of $3,500.
Great investment.
All
Good
right.
for him.
So we're going to go on the on the high side for consumer loans and say 50-50. The black guy puts down $700, which is 50%, which means he gets a home value of $1,400. Okay.
That's not as good.
No, it's not. It's going to be probably not in the same neighborhood.
Uh-huh.
Certainly not going to be as nice.
Yeah.
It's not worth as much.
Because nicer homes are in nicer neighborhoods typically.
Yes. So, and that's, keep in mind, this is assuming that you don't just get turned down by the bank, because there are no laws protecting you as a black person. So you can be turned down for a loan just because you're black. So we're assuming all of this stuff happens. We're assuming all of this works out. You get the home at that preferred 50-50 rate. So we're going to assume an appreciation on that home, on each home, at the rate of 7% annually. So every year, the value of your home goes up by 7%.
Okay.
This is in 1934. Now today, 2017, what we see is the average home value today for a new home, $368,000. Okay?
Okay.
It's pretty good. Now, 1934, that $1,400 home, after all these years, it's appreciated, and its value is $384,000.
Nice.
So it is a little bit more than average after all this time.
That's good.
Now, if you started off with that 20/80 loan,
Uh-oh.
and you got that $3,500 home,
Yeah.
that appreciates to $961,000.
It's like 3 times the value of the other home.
That is more. It is around $500,000 in wealth discrepancy
Wow.
because of one government policy. And the thing, this is not everything, but what this does is this shows you how one type of person, racially speaking, is able to pass wealth on from generation to generation. It took this long, up until 2017, for black people to break even on that investment, where the white person started,
Wow.
by the way. All right, so we're going to move on. Actually, we're not going to move on because there's one more thing. Because of
Yeah, let's stay here.
the FHA did one other thing.
I'm sure that benefited black people.
Maybe.
Okay, let's find out.
It established public housing. Where did it establish public housing? In the inner cities. And so what they did is they offered subsidized housing for people in the inner cities.
Where they lived currently.
Where they lived. Well, not necessarily.
No, that's not true.
Some of them did, but not everyone. And so what you see here is you're not able to get a loan if you're a black person.
Okay.
If you do, it's prohibitively expensive.
Yeah.
But you can get a subsidy on living in the cities. This is when we start to see the migration of populations.
Oh.
This is when we see white people largely moving to the suburbs because they have these great new loans. And we see black people moving to the inner cities.
Because they're lazy. Nope. I guess that's not the reason.
Turns out it's not.
Oh.
And it's interesting how policy
Yeah.
can shift that.
Uh-huh. Continue. Didn't want to derail you there.
That's good. So, we're going to move forward one giant year to 1935 with the Social Security Act. Because keep in mind, after the Depression, people lost everything.
That's right.
They wanted to be sure that people would have, well, some security in the social realm. And so that they would have something to fall back on for retirement that was guaranteed. That is, unless you were a farm worker or a servant, because in 1935, farm workers and servants were excluded from Social Security. What was the main professions of black people?
The educated ones, like banker and doctor.
Right. It was either that or farm workers and servants.
Oh, I see.
All right, so we're going to move forward a little bit to 1938 because keep in mind, this is still the New Deal. We were trying to come out of this massive depression. We established the minimum wage. And we've talked about this before. The minimum wage was designed to be a living wage. This is a matter of historical fact. I do not care what you are going to say. It is a matter of historical fact. That is what it was designed to be. What it is today, we could call it a perversion. We can call it whatever we want. But it is clear. You look up what he says. When I say he, of course, I mean FDR, the most popular president in U.S. history. It was designed to be a living wage. So this is great. Of course, unless you're a farm worker or a servant, because farm workers and servants were excluded from the minimum wage until 1966.
Excluded from minimum wage.
Yep. Oh, but at 1966, they didn't even get the same minimum wage. They had a reduced minimum wage. And this is until 1978. Only in 1978 did farm workers and servants actually get the same minimum wage.
Wow.
So, back from 1938. Oh, keep in mind, at the same time, farm workers and servants are not allowed to unionize.
Excellent.
Yeah, okay. So we're going to move forward from 1938 to 1944 to the GI Bill. Keep in mind, 1944 is right after World War II.
Okay.
The GI Bill, also known as Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944.
It is beer and politics after all.
Now, this is pretty amazing. The GI Bill does wonderful stuff. It provides funding for education, home loans, and unemployment benefits to returning World War II veterans.
Okay.
The GI Bill was not discriminatory.
Perfect.
This is amazing, right? This is a step in the right direction.
That's a first.
Except that in order to get the southern states on board, there needed to be some concessions. The states had the ability to control the federal funds.
Okay.
So the federal money that was to be used in your states, the states got the right to control the money. And what that means is in the southern states, where a majority of black people live, these benefits were not available. They actually weren't available in a lot of northern states either, because the states got to control it. And you give the money who do you want to. And remember, the North is still racist.
Yep.
Now, to give you an example, of the 3,229 GI Bill guaranteed loans for homes, businesses, and farms made in 1947 in Mississippi.
Okay.
2 of them were given to black veterans.
2%.
Nope.
No.
2.
2 total.
2 total out of 3,229.
Wow.
And this takes us to 1950. Now, 1950, 61.5% of black people still live in the South. So, if you still live in the South, all of these unbelievably racist laws still have a disparate impact on the black population.
Because we're still in Jim Crow.
This is still right in the midst of Jim Crow.
Wow.
And we're going to pause here before we move on to our next section. Do you have anything you'd like to add or anything you can think of?
Not cheers, man.
Cheers.
Thanks for educating me.
My pleasure.
And you're welcome for educating you.
We want to thank you guys for watching another unreal episode of Beer and Politics with your hosts, Ryan and Ryan.
Good name.
Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, on Instagram. Give a shout out to Madam Brewmaster. Give a shout out to Eastman DC.
That's right.
He's basically the newest member of our unpaid full-time production crew.
A 4-person team.
So a big thanks to him as well.
Absolutely.
And subscribe to us on YouTube, of course. Share with your friends. Leave a comment. We are on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play as a podcast.
Crushing it, bro.
Yeah, man.
That's right. Until next time, just remember, it's just beer.
And politics. It's not bad. Yeah, it's okay.